Hello students! Today we are going to start our chapter 58, starting with the cerebral cortex. This particular part will be covering slides number 33 to 54. Starting with our histology, this is something we've already covered before, but it warrants doing it again, or just mentioning it again. The cortex is about 2 to 5 millimeters thick, and it does have those 6 layers that we've learned about thus far. But what we haven't really done much with is discussing some of the neuron types that are found in the 6 layers, with the exception perhaps of some pyramidal cells in the motor section. The 3 types of neurons I wanted to make at least some brief discussions about are the granular or stellate cells, fusiform, and pyramidal. The granular cells have short axons, so they don't go very far. So they function more as interneurons within the cortex to go from one part of the cortex to a neighboring, close by part of the cortex. They can be inhibitory or excitatory. If they are excitatory, they're most likely to use glutamate as its neurotransmitter. If they're inhibitory, they're more likely to use GABA. They are very concentrated in areas where a lot of processing or association needs to be done. So if there's an area in the cortex that there's a lot of afferent movement from a variety of places and that needs to be assessed and modified or anything, then there's a lot of these types of cells in those areas. Pyramidal cells are output cells, just like the ones we learned about, the pyramidal cells of Betz, for example. And these tend to go all the way to the spinal cord or maybe to association areas from where it came from to an association area, or just at least somewhere distant in the brain from where it originated in. They're large and there's lots of them. And then fusiform are also output cells, but they're less numerous. We learned that the incoming sensory signals tended to terminate in layer 4, and that's true of a wide amount of the cortex. And then most outputs leave the cortex from layers 5 and 6, and then you have more association and interneuron-like functions in the more superficial 3 layers. Most areas of the brain have their own favorite thalamic nucleus that they have two-way connections with, some of which we've already mentioned. For instance, for vision, we already know that visual afferents land in the lateral geniculate, or from the lateral geniculate body go to the occipital cortex, and there's also communication back to the lateral geniculate body from the occipital cortex, and also the VPL for the somatosensory cortex, etc. Some of those we already know from our sensory discussions, but every other part of the cortex has its own favorite thalamic nucleus. In fact, if you were to damage the thalamic nucleus associated with that particular part of the cortex, the deficit's going to look very much like if you had damage to the cortex directly. Now, note that except for some olfactory pathways, all sensory information passes to the cortex after first synapsing in that thalamus. It's also handy to look at the cortex in terms of functional areas. Once again, we already know a lot about these already. Again, vision in the back, in the occipital lobe, somatosensory in the postcentral gyrus, primary motor here, and then various supplementary motors and so on here. Here they mentioned that speech area and eye fixation centers as well. And then hearing. And they didn't put it down here, but of course the taste and smell are in this area. But some areas that we haven't really spent much time with are a lot of this stuff in this area and over here as well. So that's what we're going to look at as we move through here. Once again, there's our primary and secondary motors redefined for you. Nothing new. Same stuff we looked at before as far as motor. And then sensory, primary and secondary sensory. Again, that is illustrated over here in the ways that we have discussed already. So here again is those areas in pink now that we are going to define a little bit more. Our parieto-occipital temporal association area, named that way because it's in between those three lobes that it's in its name. And then we have our limbic association area, in which we can't see all of it because it's kind of internal a little bit as well. And then prefrontal association area. What they all do, what they all have in common, these association areas, is they receive and analyze information, sensory and otherwise, from multiple places. Not only just sensory, but motor as well, of course. And it's taking that wide variety of information and doing a lot of processing for a variety of purposes. Starting with the parieto-occipital temporal association area. Once again, it's between the parietal, occipital, and temporal areas where we have the primary sensory, vision, and auditory information coming from those areas. And it essentially, the way I like to think about it is it helps us understand our position in the world we're in. It helps us with our awareness of our surroundings and ourselves within that surroundings. And you just use one sensation for all of that. You synthesize a lot of sensations from a lot of different areas to help us with that understanding. There's some some subspecializations that I would like to mention. Upper parieto-occipital cortex. So that would be a little bit higher up in this area. That is our spatial coordinates of our body and its surroundings in that area. Wernicke's area is a language comprehension area, or sometimes called the general interpretive area or Gnostic area. And Wernicke's area is necessary for speech, but not because it has a motor function, but rather Wernicke's area is where you put together the ideas of what you want to say. All right, so that's why it's called Gnostic, is meaning to know. You understand what language means, what words mean, not only to understand it when it's spoken to you, but also to formulate a speech that you want to say. And it is especially developed on the left side in most people. The right side doesn't seem to have much of a Wernicke's area, if at all, so that only the left brain is verbal and understands language. Angular gyrus is an initial processing area for reading, and they think perhaps this might be damage to this area might cause some forms of dyslexia, but not all dyslexias are going to be due to an angular gyrus lesion. So where's the angular gyrus? Well, another picture will show it better, but it's back here about that area. Anterior lateral occipital and posterior temporal lobe. That particular area in the parieto-occipital temporal association area is an area for naming objects. So if you pick up an object, right, there's an object, then you know it's a pencil. The reason why you can name that object is because of that particular part of our parieto-occipital temporal association area. Prefrontal association area. Let's peek back at that again. That's up here now. We're moving away from the parieto-occipital temporal with those subspecializations that we mentioned, and we're going to look at this prefrontal association area. This helps plan complex patterns and sequences of motor movements. So yes, it needs to have a tremendous amount of input from our sensory areas, particularly our parieto-occipital temporal cortex we just talked about, because that is where we have our spatial understanding of where we are in space. And you can't plan complex patterns and appropriate motor sequences without that information. Yes, you also need to process some of that input through the basal ganglia circuits that we learned about in an earlier lecture. And yes, the thalamus, because all cortical areas have to bounce things back and forth between the thalamus and back to the motor cortex. So it is having a lot of processing in those various areas together. Thought seems to be something that a term that is often ascribed to the prefrontal area. Well, we'll talk a little bit more about thoughts later, but the types of things that we're trying to refer to here is non-motor types of thinking, short-term working memory, and elaboration of thought. Working memory, I guess I'll define that now, but working memory has to do with sort of like if you are familiar with computers, that RAM memory, random access memory, is the memory that is being used by the computer right now, as opposed to memory that's stored in a hard disk, for example. So this is sort of like that for us. Our prefrontal area will download, if you like, information from the more permanent memory storage areas of the brain, and then use that in conjunction with what's going on now, what you remember from the past, and so on and so forth. You can't do this well without our prefrontal area. Elaboration of thought, I think we'll have a better description of that in a little bit. Within the prefrontal association area, you also have Broca's area. And this is another place that has to do with speech, but in this case, Broca's area is necessary to coordinate the muscles themselves in order to accomplish speech. So Broca's area is not for understanding what speech means or picking words that you want to say, but rather giving you the coordination to get your muscles in your tongue and lips and so on to do the job of speaking. So you need Wernicke's area to decide what to say. You need Broca's area to be able to articulate it, to get the brain to coordinate the mouth, etc. Okay. What about the limbic association area? Now, in that earlier picture, we saw a lateral view of the brain, and the most inferior parts of that, you saw a little bit of limbic area. But here we have a medial view of the brain. Not the clearest image, but it works. And there are several different areas that would be fitting into this limbic association area. The anterior part of the temporal lobe, the ventral part of the frontal lobe, so down in this area, and the cingulate gyrus, which is that gyrus that lies above and around the corpus callosum. And that's here it's highlighted in yellow. And this is associated with the limbic system, as you might guess, and the limbic system has to do with drive, motivation, motions, and things of that nature. We are going to have a section on limbic area, or limbic system specifically, so we'll elaborate on that then. Back to the idea of Wernicke's area and Broca's area. Here they are again. Here's for language comprehension. Here they put down intelligence, meaning that, hey, I guess understanding complex language does take intelligence, so I suppose that's fine to call it that. And then here's our Broca's area, that helps you learn words, and or not learn, but helps you speak words. Sorry. Wernicke's input comes from a variety of sources, because language can be a variety of things. You can read words on a page, that would be visual input. You could hear someone speak, that would be auditory input. For sensations, there can be things you can touch that might be language-based. Probably the most obvious would be Braille for blind people. That's a language, and that has to be dependent on the sense of touch in order to interpret that. But if it is a symbolic language of some sort, Wernicke's area seems to be the area that is necessary for that. Another area that's interesting is on the inferior parts of the brain. Here they cut the brainstem almost completely off so you can see it. That's the midbrain right there. But in the most inferior and medial parts of the temporal lobes, so these are the temporal lobes here and here on the underside of the brain, most medial parts of those temporal lobes right up against the sides of the brainstem. This is our facial recognition area. That apparently we have a large area of cerebral cortex that helps us recognize faces. Facial recognition is extremely important for social creatures such as ourselves, and even other animals that are social animals. Facial recognition is important for them too. And the inability to recognize faces could be due to damage to these areas. And it has a big name, prosopagnosia. It's very, very rare. But these people will never recognize anyone. They'll see the people, they'll see that they're humans, but they won't be able to recognize that this is my uncle and that is my nephew or anything like that, or my sister. They wouldn't be able to recognize faces that way. Language processing, we already mentioned, requires sensory input from the ears, eyes, etc. So if you have a loss of your auditory association areas, that can cause what's called an auditory receptive aphasia or word deafness. So the ears are still there, the ears still hear, but if you don't have the appropriate auditory association areas to help to interpret what that means, then you have what's called auditory receptive aphasia or word deafness. Similarly, if you have a loss of your visual association areas, you have a visual receptive aphasia or word blindness, and some forms of dyslexia might be in this category. And again, your eyes are still working, the person still sees, but they will not be able to interpret language and so on and so forth without those association areas in particular. Wernicke's aphasia would be even worse. If you have damage to the Wernicke's area, then both the written and spoken word is going to be damaged. Again, this has to be in the left hemisphere or the dominant hemisphere. But then you would have problem with language more globally and not just one sense over another. And then global aphasia is when you have a lesion extending beyond Wernicke's. It includes the angular gyrus, maybe some of the temporal areas or more areas of the parietal lobe, so it's beyond that. And then these people are completely incapable of understanding communication in any way, and moreover, they're confused. They don't know where they are in space. They're disoriented completely. That's called global aphasia. So a summary of language processing, you have them continued anyway. You have the motor output from Wernicke's. That is what helps you choose your words. There's another kind of aphasia called Broca's aphasia, and that is a aphasia that you can't just get the words out of your mouth. You know what you want to say, you understand the language, you have your speech eloquently planned, but you can't get your mouth and tongue and everything to cooperate to say it, because that is the motor part of the speech. Okay. Articulation also, of course, requires other areas of the motor system, cerebellum, basal ganglia, etc. as well. Don't forget that. Here we have some simplified examples of language processing. On the top is what it looks like if someone were to be asked to repeat a word spoken to them. They'd hear the word and it'd be processed in the temporal lobe. Then it would go to Wernicke's to understand what the word means, then send it to Broca's area to plan the mouth and tongue and everything to how they're going to say it, and then to the motor cortex to actually initiate the output. That's in order to speak a heard word. On this one, we have speaking a written word. If you were asked to read a word on a page, you'll read it, you'll see it in your occipital cortex, interpret it over here in your angular gyrus first. Seems to be the angular gyrus is important for another extra step for reading, and then to Wernicke's area for understanding, and then the same is true the rest of the way through here, where you go to Broca's and then the motor cortex to say the word you read. The two hemispheres, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere of the brain, do communicate with each other. They communicate via the corpus callosum and through the anterior commissure. The corpus callosum, as you've seen in anatomy, is a pretty broad connection and interconnects most of the left and right hemispheres to each other. However, the most anterior parts use the anterior commissure for their communication. So what's interesting is if there's a reason why the corpus callosum had to be cut or was cut, then that means the left brain and the right brain aren't aware of each other and don't know what each other is doing. And there's a really interesting phenomenon that's called split brain phenomenon, which the link over here, if it plays on your own slide set, you can go ahead and watch it yourself. But that shows an interesting situation where someone had to have a cut of their corpus callosum to treat a severe epilepsy. And it's really fascinating. You should take a moment to look at it. The anterior commissure interconnects anterior temporal lobes and the amygdala together, so the more anterior parts. And since a lot of those have to do with emotional things and limbic system type of functions, that helps to unify those activities bilaterally. I promised I was going to discuss thought a little bit more. I sort of glossed over it, but thought in a lot of sense is happening a lot in the frontal lobe, but not exclusively. Thought is too broad of a term, the way it's defined, to really say, hey, it's just here. So they don't think, at least in the current understanding of how the brain works, that no one cortical area by itself seems to be involved with thought. It seems to involve many areas of the cortex. However, different flavors of that thought, if you want to think of it that way, come from different areas. For example, the lower brain like brainstem, etc., or thalamus and things like that, those determine the nature of the thought, whether it's a pleasant or unpleasant, or it's painful or whatever. So those sort of background kind of aspects of the thought. Whereas the more specifics about the thought, the upper brain is involved with that. So where exactly you're feeling something, if that's part of your thought, what you're seeing and what you're thinking about what you're seeing, recognizing what things are, stuff like that. That's going to be more upper brain. So given that, our best definition of thought thus far these days is the holistic theory of thought. And as you can see, there's a nice direct quote from your Guyton and Hall. Thought results from a pattern of stimulation of many parts of the nervous system at the same time and in definite sequence, probably involving most importantly the cerebral cortex, thalamus, limbic system, and the reticular formation. So there again, this seems to be a holistic kind of pattern. Now, if you looked at the split brain video that was a link on the previous page, the neuroscientist there thinks that there is one place where all of the thinking ends up, and there's like a final place for the thought to happen. Current understanding or current wisdom from neuroscience these days, I think that other video is a little old, don't think that's the case, that it's just one place. And that the left brain and right brain are both intelligent, it's just that the left brain is the one that's verbal, and the right brain is thinking and knows what it's doing, but it is not verbal. That's the only thing it doesn't do. So, consciousness is our last slide for this set, and let's define that, I guess. It is our continuing stream of awareness of either our surroundings or our sequential thoughts. So, if you are in a sensory deprivation chamber of some kind, where you can't see or hear, or maybe you're floating in some sort of liquid, so you have very minimal sensations of touch, and these sorts of things, I guess, can happen. But you still can be conscious, because you could still have a mind that is aware of its thinking, of what it is thinking about. But otherwise, yes, consciousness is you're aware of your surroundings, and it's unlike sleep or comas, right? So that concludes this particular section, and we'll catch you on the next one.